Okay, good evening. I've been saying at the beginning of every class this week that if we get an alert, continue. If we get a siren, we're on pause. So we'll see what happens. Bezrat Hashem will get through the class without a siren, without an alert, without Shabbat coming to my door. You never know what can happen. Okay, what we are going to do momentarily is get back to the topic of conservative Judaism. After we finish that, we're going to go, into the topic of Jews coming to America. But first, I need to correct something, right a wrong. One of the not dangers, one of the situations that one encounters when you teach a lot, you're sometimes going to say, more often than not, there's going to be a class here or there that you're going to say something that is incorrect or maybe insensitive or not the right historical information. So I mentioned something in passing in a class recently, and someone who listened to it called me up or messaged me, and I was very happy, very, very happy. This individual messaged me and said that I kind of fluffed over something that's in the DNA of Israel that I didn't give proper respect to. Didn't say it like that, but I'm saying this. I'm seeing it. We give proper time to, and the gravitas of this, and that had to do with a poem that I said. I remembered vaguely, and even though I really did later, I thought about it, remembered it. A poem written by Natan Alterman called Magash Kesef, or Al Magash Kesef, on the silver platter, which was written in response to a statement by Chaim Weizmann after the vote in the UN for the partition plan, where he said no country is given to someone on a silver platter. And this was his response, that the generations that brought us to the point of statehood and their sacrifice with the silver platter upon which the country has been given to us. So I want to write that. I'm going to send out a little bit of a background, send out the poem in Hebrew and English. It's a beautiful poetic Hebrew with the English translation. Bezrat Hashem, I'll send it out with a little background because I think it is absolutely worthwhile for everybody to hear it. If you're not sure who he was, if you're lucky enough to have a 200 shekel bill in your pocket, he is on the 200 shekel bill. It tells you he's from 1910 to 1970, 60 years old, an accomplished poet, author. He was part of the, like I say, part of the DNA of this country. And my apologies to him for glancing over something so significant. Okay, so I will send it out, Bezrat Hashem. We're on the conservative Judaism topic. We gave some background. I gave some background already. And what I want to talk about now is following up on a statement I made that said that conservative Judaism originally was not meant as a, quote, denomination or this additional pathway of Judaism. Already Reform had made its inroads. And we know, of course, that going back to the time of Shimshon Raphael Hirsch and the Chassam Sofer, that it was they were fighting tooth and nail against the Reform movement. But this is a little bit later, it's the early 1900s. It wasn't meant to be. It was meant to be something of a to mollify some of the people. They shouldn't go to Reform Judaism, should stick with the Rabbinic Judaism, i.e., what's called Orthodox Judaism. It had a rabbinic orientation, it had a rabbinic background. But what happens over time is the sociological forces bring about some institutionalization of the conservative movement. Already JTS has been opened, the Jewish Theological Seminary, but now it's actually training rabbis. These rabbis are then sent out to various synagogues around the United States. Those synagogues end up forming some kind of a network, and eventually the boundaries of what conservative Judaism, as it becomes known, start to harden and becomes, okay, these are our guidelines, these are our approaches to things. And two key institutions are founded. In 1913 is the United Synagogue of America, which for people who grew up in America, you hear United Synagogue, you know that's a conservative movement. You go to the UK, it means something else. The United Synagogue is the Orthodox arm. And there's the RA, the Rabbinical Assembly. But conservative Judaism became non-reform, means not Reform Judaism, non-Orthodox, because it wasn't really Orthodox Judaism, and became eventually some form of a separate movement. Kind of fast forward with a spoiler alert, the people who in the past, let's say go into the 1960s, when it was really gaining speed, 60s and 70s, it was becoming a force to be reckoned with. The movement itself has been dwindling over the years, last 10, 20 years. Many people are either moving to Reform or moving to Orthodox, and they're getting squeezed out in the conservative movement. So, what did it mean, though? Okay, what did it mean? How do you become a separate movement within Judaism? And okay, so they had to, it had to start with somewhere within the area of halacha, a break with halacha. They started writing their own responsa, the Shelot and Shuvot, which we talked about extensively a long time ago, the time the Gaonim, the 800s, 900s, about the year, even a little before the year 1000. There's Shelot and Shuvot that would go back and forth about, we'll see, we'll talk about a couple of them, whether it's driving on Shabbat to Shul or others. They had to come up with their own halachic statements that would be different from what was being promulgated in the more Orthodox world, but they still wanted to base what they said on Mikorot, or sources in Chazal, in Chachamenu Zichronim Levarcha, in other words, in the Gemara or a Mishnah or Shulchan Aruch, which is kind of counterintuitive. In other words, they wanted to use a foundation, but it was twisted, meaning they were using it in the wrong way to build up what they believe was. Now, by the way, that can happen by accident too. A person, an Orthodox rabbi, can misinterpret a statement by Chazal, can misinterpret a halacha, can misinterpret a Gemara. It happens. But this wasn't a misinterpretation. This was taking it and sometimes twisting it. They actually convened, I don't know if it's the right word, founded a committee. It was called the Committee on Committee on Jewish Law and Standards. And what was it they were trying to come up with? So if you start to become a movement, let's talk about, and I don't mean to put Chabad and conservative Judaism in the same category, God forbid. Chabad is an unbelievable movement. Just ask Tucker Carlson, who's probably done more for raising money for Chabad in the last few days than any telethon or anything they could have run. Chabad has certain shitot. They have certain approaches. They're part of Orthodox Judaism. The Alter Rebbe, the Admor Zaken, the Baal HaTanya, who began the movement in the 1700s, wrote what was known as the Shulchan Aruch Harav. So they have some differences in their approaches to halacha in Chabad, known as Chabad Lubavitch. But they have a certain approach to tefillah, a certain approach to outreach, obviously, certain approach, but it's still within the construct of halacha. They have boundaries. They're not going to say, yeah, you can be machal Shabbat and just go ahead and do what you want if it's helping the general. That's not what they do. So every division, even look at the Dati Lumi world, look at the Haredi world, everyone has their red lines. Everyone has that with your coloring within certain lines. Some of the two biggest things that could separate, in general, I'm not talking about the army or anything right now, that separate, let's say, the Haredi world from the Dati Lumi world has to do with the position of women in the religion and in education, in the home, outside the home, the status of the land of Israel. There are the massive things, but when you get down to it, this is super important to understand. Whether it's Chabad or Dati Lumi or Haredi or Litvish or Hasidish, whatever title you have, all these different subcategories of what we could call normative, halachic, rabbinic, Orthodox Judaism, 90% of what we do, we have in common. It's the vast majority. And that's what's really important to highlight. Now we switch back to look at the conservative Judaism, and we have to see how do they deal with treating what we call halacha. When it came to Shelot and Shuvot, or responsa, halachic responsa, which is the plural of responsum, in Latin, it goes to an A from a UM ending, like never mind, I'm not going to get to that. This is the class in Latin. Just don't misuse alumnus and alumna and alumni, because they are not the same thing. Anyways, they would sometimes have multiple responsa to the same question, and they would be contradictory, and both would be acceptable, which doesn't make sense. Minority opinions would be institutionalized. What did that mean? Let's say, if you have any familiarity with the Gemara, you may know that the idea in general, you'll see a machloket or a dispute between the chachamim, the rabbis, plural, let's say a whole number of rabbis, and one individual. And usually, almost always, but not always, the majority rules. And if the majority say that's the way it is, that's the way it is, and the other person's marginalized, at least for that halacha, and it's not an accepted opinion. And that's pretty much when you go through halacha, that's how it works. But they were willing to say if there's what's called a da'at yachid, an individual's opinion, they'll be able to, that was different than what would be the accepted normative halacha, they would use it as a basis for a certain statement in their responsa. Because consensus was more important than legitimacy. Because we're all going to get along. We're all going to say, we're going to give credit to the dat yachid, to the one who says just that's his own opinion, fine, but he's a legitimate person to rely on for this. From an Orthodox perspective, this already marks a very significant break from psak halacha. Psak is lifsok halacha, or psika, is the idea of having a question of halacha and the rabbi making a decision. I found my milchik spoon in the fleshik dishwasher. Now what do I do? See, I never had that question at home. We don't have a dishwasher, so it makes that part easy. But in general, all these kind of questions. So there's a way to answer. You have certain things you have to know. When was it last used? Blah blah. There's a lot of stuff. But when it came to the conservative movement, and we're going to see soon some very specific breaks from normative halacha, it wasn't so. They're changing the way the psak halacha was rendered. Truth is that early on, in the let's say the middle 1940s, like the end of World War II, till about the middle of the 60s, so let's say roughly 1945 to 1965, conservative Judaism, I mentioned this early at the beginning, it flourished. It was attracting a lot of middle-class America. Suburban synagogues were being built. Hebrew schools were being built. Day school system. They ended up with a day school system under the name of Solomon Schechter. If you remember, we talked about Solomon Schechter, one of the forebearers of the conservative movement, who himself was not looking to make a movement himself. That wasn't his goal. But what happened was that there's the they called white flight. It's not a very PC term, but that's what it was. The people start moving out to the suburbs. They didn't have their local Ahavas Achim shul next door to them. And they just start to build something. And, like the shuls could be far away. They wide open suburban areas. And they were, okay, so we'll build a synagogue. Different movements called a temple, a synagogue, whatever it would be. And it was attractive to middle-class Americans who were becoming more affluent, and they could support a larger synagogue or temple. I have been in my fair share of conservative and reform temples, a handful, not too many, but some. It's sad on the one hand because they're usually empty, especially within the reform world, and they're massive. Absolutely, I've seen some massive that holds 2,000-3,000 people in the main sanctuary, and it's a few days a year it's active. They have lots of activities and everything else. But on the other hand, there's still something. There's a connection, especially within the conservative world. But again, it's flourishing in the 40s through the 60s. They're having day schools. This Solomon Schechter school system still exists in the United States. And for a period of time, it seemed that conservative Judaism was going to be the future of American Judaism. Again, put it into perspective. We obviously haven't touched World War I yet. We haven't touched World War II. But jump ahead to just the end of World War II. And, people leaving, and we're going to talk about that hopefully still this evening. Jews starting to come to America. It was, as they say, a vast wasteland when it came to the Torah. There are various institutions that spring up early on, whether it's Torah Masorah, the OU, the Young Israel movement, which will eventually get the ball rolling, especially Torah Masorah, but the founding of day schools around the country. But at this point, this is the exact same time, there's not a lot there going on in the United States. There's still Torah, there's still institution, there's still learning. Of course there is. But as far as the vast network that exists today, is day and night. And now at this point, in the mid-40s, after World War II, it's flourishing conservative Judaism seems to be, it's going to be the movement in the United States. But observance levels still remained inconsistent. Kashrut was partial, which meant, the expression, I keep kosher in my home, which meant they'll eat non-kosher out. Some who will be more religious won't eat meat and milk together out of the house, but they'll still eat at non-kosher restaurants. Shabbat observance became weakened, especially after they paskined, in quotes, that you could drive to shul on Shabbat. The Chag, Yom Tov, was chopped down from 2 days to 1 day. Halacha increasingly became symbolic rather than behavior. What is the difference? Behavioral, which we just talked about last night in the Mishlei class, is how Torah becomes a part of who we are. It's not just our map, it is our life. Everything we do, we can plug into every single moment from the time we wake up, the time we go to sleep. There's something that we can do and connect to within the Torah world. Whether a person's at work or they're watching a show, or there's some connection we can make. That's behavioral. That's how we behave relative to Torah. Increasingly symbolic meant, we're going to have a bar bat mitzvah, so we have to have a candle lighting ceremony. We have to have maybe the boy by tefillin he'll put on today, and maybe he'll put on again for his wedding day. And this creates an internal strain within the conservative movement and between the conservative Orthodox movement. And the question is, can halacha, the conservative movement was unlike the reform movement. The conservative movement wasn't throwing halacha out the window. They were trying to change it, adapt it to make it fit the times. But they weren't trying to throw it out the window. But now when there's a diminution and a degradation is a better word, a degradation of halacha and standards, how does halacha survive when it's not being widely practiced? So there's some major halachic turning points. We're going to talk 1950 is when they make a decision, it became a landmark decision in the conservative movement, which became an irreversible decision that, you let the cat out of the bag. And that was number one was driving. There was a few of them. One is driving to shul on Shabbat. They justified it halachically. It was socially or sociologically, it was catastrophic. Why was it catastrophic? Because now, it obviously opened the door to Chilul Shabbat, to profaning Shabbat, but also it meant that what happens when you have a community, you have a shul, and you have an Orthodox shul, Orthodox community. That meant that not weekdays, but Shabbat, it had to be basically within walking distance, and your community thrived and centered around the shul, at least on Shabbat, in a good community every day of the week, whether it's minyanim or daf yomi or social activities or whatever it might be. When you start spreading out and say, okay, we could drive 10 miles to the synagogue, that changes the sociological makeup of the community. You no longer have to be in the same community with people who are like-minded like you are. That's number one, was the driving to shul on Shabbat. The second one was mixed seating. Just as a side note, I mentioned this, I think, somewhere along the way, we were talking about the Middle Ages, that the two Ashkenazi and Sfaradi worlds of shuls, Batei Knesset, were influenced apparently by their host countries, which is why most Ashkenazi shuls are set up like what we call pews, just rows, and that's like Havdalah was founded churches, and among the Sephardi world, it was more like in a U shape or like going around the perimeter of the shul. Not all of them. The one I daven at actually is the main one I daven at is there two of them, not set up. There's some just like an Ashkenazi shul, like with rows. More influenced possibly by the mosques. Again, yes or no, but I've heard this, whether it's factual or not. But there was still one thing that was important to both Ashkenazim and Sfaradim, and that was separate seating, a mechitza. How high, how tall, glass, one-way glass, how does that be the Berlin Wall? Not important now. The concept, though, was separate seating. And the conservative movement in 1950 introduces mixed seating. There were some that still exist that have, and I know of at least one Orthodox shul like this, they have three possibilities. There's men on one side, women on the other side, and the center is a mix of men and women. But otherwise, for the most part, within the average conservative synagogue, it was mixed seating. It wasn't initially accepted by all, because even those who remember, you're talking about people who grew up. If you're now in 1950, and this is coming to fruition, you're an adult with children, you grew up, let's say, in the 30s. And in the 30s, if you were going to shul, if your family, your father, your grandfather, your grandparents were were religious, you grew up with it with separate seating. So it wasn't originally, even it rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, but eventually becomes normative. Um, when I was living in Chicago, I had the zechut, and it really was, to go 8 years in a row to with a trip. And I've mentioned this general concept before. It was sponsored by the Federation of Chicago, Jewish Federation of Chicago. There was a committee that I chaired along with a rabbi who was a Reform rabbi, wonderful human being. It was called the Rabbinic Action Committee, RAC, Rabbinic Action Committee. And the idea was born. We thought it'd be a one-off, but we did it 8 years. I did it 8 years ago. It's been going on since, of rabbis of Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform shuls traveling together to Eastern Europe, visiting a city that had both modern-day institutions that were funded by Federation or by Joint or by Hayas, et cetera, and also had some historical background, whether it's 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 150 years ago. We would go to those cities, spend 4 days there, and fly out, come to Israel, and spend the next 4 days here. They were tremendous trips, fantastic, but it had some growing pains. Growing pains were it came time to daven in the morning or in the evening, especially in the morning. And here you have a mix of Orthodox, Conservative, Reform. Each one had different approach. You know, we're going to take, all of a sudden, you're going to have an Orthodox menu with women putting on tefillin and women wanting to lane and mixed seating. So a little bit of growing pains where we eventually were able to find our sea legs or whatever the expression is. And it was we all agreed to have our own approach. And here would be the Orthodox, there would be the non-Orthodox, and whoever what they wanted to do. But the beginning was a little bit uncomfortable, to be honest. It wasn't very clear. And that is a direct result of what was going on here in the 1950s when they start to introduce this idea of allowing mixed seating. And then in addition to this, in 1985, the conservative movement made the decision to ordain women as rabbis. I'm not going to, because we're talking about conservative Judaism, I'm not going to digress other than on this topic within the Orthodox world, other than to make a comment that my guess is that within the next 25 years, or we already have a concept of women being ordained as rabbis within the Orthodox world. And there are women who serve right now as in the function. I believe Danny Mervis's wife is one of them. But there are a kind of an adjunct kind of an idea of women who are there to assist other women to take questions that maybe women would not want to ask a male rabbi, which is fantastic. We have through Nishmat and through so many different organizations that are out there now that are enabling women to just the amount of Torah, I've mentioned this before, that coming from the female world right now over the last many years, the last 10, 15 years especially, is just mind-boggling. It's fantastic. With my personal position, I don't have a position, at least not publicly on this. But I think the idea of just, having some outlet for people who want to seek the guidance of a woman instead of a man, I think is fantastic. So they officially, in 1985, so it's a little over 40 years ago, ordained women. They counted a woman to a minyan and also could be Torah readers. By the way, al pi halacha, a woman could read the Torah. As it mentions in halacha that it can be done, but it's considered not kavod hatzibur. It's not considered respect for the public. Again, I'm just quoting to you. Don't shoot the messenger. I'm just telling you what the Shulchan Aruch says. But each step that they took, whether it was driving on Shabbat, mixed seating, women being ordained, Torah readers, starts to alter the living meaning of halacha. They have strayed greatly in that area. By the 20th century, by the late 20th century, JTS widely accepted what was called the documentary hypothesis, which is that the Torah is a compilation of various writings. One thing that we have to understand as Orthodox Jews, there's one foundation besides we believe in God and God created the world, is that Torah is divine. It was given to us by Hashem. It's not man-made. It's not written by multiple authors over a period of centuries. It's from Hashem. That was not completely accepted by JTS faculty, even more so by the reform movement, saying definitely not. It's divinely inspired. Humans wrote it, and definitely not from God. They also redefined revelation, meaning Har Sinai, as a human divine encounter. That the authorship of the Torah is not uniformly affirmed in the fact that no, not God did not necessarily write give us the whole Torah, which is a huge and probably the biggest break. I mean, you want to count a woman to women, not count a woman to men. You want to have separate seating, you want mixed seating. You want to drive on Shabbat, but to say the Torah is not from God, it's not divine from Hashem himself, that's probably the biggest break from Orthodox theology. And halacha could no longer rest on the shoulders, as we know it, of the conservative movement, and starts to implode as far as halacha within the world of the conservative movement. By the 1990s, there were many people within the conservative movement that were called legal pluralists, traditionalists. The movement no longer spoke with one voice about many things, whether Torah min Hashemayim. There still are who say within the conservative movement, Torah is min Hashemayim, that Hashem did give us the Torah, that halacha is or is not, depending on who you ask within the conservative movement, if it was binding on everybody, and the limits amount of change that could be made to halacha. So all these things put together give us a real interesting picture of some shifts sociologically, Judaically, religiously, just the whole thing. The reform movement in the 1800s, mid 1900s, the birth of the conservative movement and the changes that goes through. And what happens? We take a look at the religious world, at the Orthodox world. We're not going to go into that now, but if you were to walk into a Jewish community that wasn't in the process of going through pogroms or something, just a normative Orthodox community in the year 800, or the year 1600, or the year 2000, or today, generally speaking, you would feel at home. It doesn't mean that they're going to be, eating the matzah the same way you eat your matzah. It doesn't mean that, but I'm saying generally, as far as halacha, approach to Torah, to learning, the Gemara would be the same Gemara, the Torah would be the same Torah. That has stayed consistent. Same thing with tefillah. An Ashkenazi Jew can go to almost any Ashkenazi shul in the world and feel they may not like the length of the daf, they may not like the rabbi speak, whatever it is, but we always find what to complain about. But at least you're going to feel at home. And Sfaradi will, depending on what Eidah they are, will feel comfortable in almost any Sfaradi place they're going to go to. Same thing is true with Chabad. Same thing is true with in a Hasidic type of world, because it stays consistent. Yes, we have changes, and yes, there's been growth. And Baruch Hashem, there have been some very good, nice changes in growth. Maybe not enough yet, but there are. But when you take a look at the conservative movement, put aside the reform movement, when you look at the conservative movement, it has gone through ebbs and flows, and it's gone through ups and downs and growth and pullback, and what looked like just a modification of Orthodox Judaism early on became a completely different parallel stream running next to Orthodox Judaism. I've had over the years questions of something to the effect of, my cousin's getting married is having a bat mitzvah in a conservative shul, or there's a bar mitzvah in a conservative shul. What do I do? How do I go? It's mixed seating and all. So generally speaking, I've said I told people that daven at home if you can, if there's no Orthodox shul, and then go and sit in the back. Go and sit in the back. Especially for shalom bayit. I wouldn't necessarily say that with everything, but in the conservative place, that's probably one of the better approaches. But each case, I can't make a general statement, but each case is on its own. Okay, time to shift gears. We're going to do that. I'll take a drink for that. It's only water, though.
Zev,
Yes.
may I ask?
Yes.
Unlike the Reform movement, which was an international thing, was the
Yes.
conservative movement only in the United States?
Yeah, for the most part, it was only the United States. That is correct. Very good question. I want to start this next section. Put something on the screen here. Why is this not working?
Thank you.
I want to put something on the screen. What is going on? My computer just doesn't like me today. There. As an introduction, we're going to talk about Jews coming to America. But I want to get something set up here so I can show it to you. First, let me get past the commercial, and then I will share the screen with. Okay. Make sure I have the speed correct. Normal. This is 1080. I'm not going to show the entire thing because it's 7 minutes, but I do want to show part of this. It's a nice little introduction to what we're going to get into next, which has to do with Jews coming to America. We're going to go back a little bit in time. Obviously, at some point, not tonight probably, we're going to be talking about Ellis Island and some of the misconceptions and some of the real stories and quote some people who went through there. Let me go to here and share with sound. Share and make this large. Hold on. Okay, you should still see in front of your screen something says a Jewish American tale. You see that? Just go like that. If you see it in the bottom left of the corner screen, you see it? No. Okay. So let me try this again because I think I messed something up here. Okay, let's try again. How about now? You should see something over here. It says a Jewish American tale. All right. Okay, I'm going to put this on full screen. Minimize this. Full screen and put the sound back on. Okay.
In the early 20th century, American xenophobia and anti-Semitism, combined with the desire to fit in, pushed many Jewish immigrants to downplay their Judaism. They turned their backs on their old countries to embrace their new home, even when that new home wasn't too happy to have them. But when their brothers and sisters in Europe faced a crisis of unimaginable horror, these American Jews were forced to reconsider their place in America. While Jews began arriving in America in the 1600s, there were still less than 200,000 American Jews by the end of the 19th century, when over 2 million Jews from Russia arrived, fleeing pogroms. Unfortunately for these new immigrants, the 2 million Jews arrived as part of a larger wave of over 20 million total immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe that sparked a backlash among Anglo-Americans who wanted to keep out immigrants they considered racially or culturally inferior. Congress passed the Johnson-Reed Act in 1924, limiting the annual quota of immigrants from each country to only 2% of the population from that country recorded on the U.S. Census of 1890. Lawmakers purposely chose a census taken before the peak of the immigration wave, a time when Anglo-Saxons made up a much larger percentage of a population than they did in 1924. As a result, this 2% quota created extremely strict limits on Italians, Poles, Jews, and other immigrants from outside of Western Europe. Through this law, senators sought to massively decrease the immigration of what one of the law's sponsors called men of alien speech and thoughts and habits. After the Johnson-Reed Act, the influx of Jews all but stopped, and as the Jews who were already in America had children, native-born Jewish Americans became a larger and larger portion of the population. These native-born Jews sought to rise above the hard labor and crowded tenements that characterized the lives of many of their parents. They excelled in school and pursued higher education to gain access to middle-class careers. By 1900, Jews made up 8.5% of college students, despite representing only 2% of the U.S. population. And by 1935, 60% of native-born Jews in New York were working in clerical or related white-collar work, compared to only 10% of their immigrant parents. Education offered an opportunity to join the middle class, but it also compounded the threat of assimilation. Public schools sought to Americanize Jewish children by promoting American values, celebrating holidays like Halloween and Christmas, and sometimes even encouraging them to look down on their parents for being greenhorns who couldn't speak proper English. As a result of these pressures, many young Jews rejected aspects of their Jewish identity and even changed their names to conceal their heritage. Educated Jews with white-collar jobs began to build a new Jewish middle class in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s. These newly prosperous Jews often cared more about social and educational opportunities than religious responsibilities. To maintain the relevance of synagogues for these less observant Jews, many rabbis added events and classes that focused on cultural rather than religious concerns. For example, the bar mitzvah transformed from a meaningful but simple religious ceremony into an elaborate social affair with food and dancing. While Jews embraced America, much of America didn't reciprocate. As economically mobile Jews sought out middle-class opportunities like universities, suburbs, and vacations, institutions restructured their admission to keep them out. Suburbs relied on restrictive housing covenants, and universities instated Jewish quotas, while many hotels and resorts simply banned Jews outright. Public figures like the famed pilot Charles Lindbergh and radio personality Father Charles Coughlin expressed sympathy for German fascism, while the German-American Bund drew over 20,000 supporters to a fascist rally in Madison Square Garden. Barred from access to many aspects of middle-class America, Jews built parallel institutions that mimicked the organizations that rejected them, embracing American values despite meeting with American resistance. They established communities and neighborhoods like Grand Concourse in the Bronx and the Upper West Side in Manhattan that offered tree-lined streets and parks similar to the suburbs. They built community centers in cities and resorts in the Poconos and Catskills. But as the community was turning inwards and embracing the ideals in their new home, a new threat was rising back in Europe. When the Nazis took over Germany in the 1930s, American Jewish communities struggled to reconcile the desire to help their Jewish brethren with their fear of rocking the boat. When a group of Jewish veterans boycotted German goods in 1935, the president of the American Jewish Committee called it dangerous because it would alienate the rest of America. Organizations such as the Joint Distribution Committee, formed by wealthy members of the Reform movement, and the Orthodox Va'ad Ha'Hatzalah Rescue Committee did manage to fund rescue efforts that saved tens of thousands of Jews. Overall, though, the response among American Jews was muted by a desire to fit in and avoid triggering further anti-Semitism. While it is impossible to know if a more forceful response from the Jewish world would have affected policy, it is clear that the U.S. government proved tragically resistant to helping Jews escape the Holocaust. America accepted around 200,000 refugees between 1933 and 1945, most of them Jewish, but authorities rejected hundreds of thousands of desperate asylum seekers, and boats of desperate refugees were turned back to die in Nazi gas chambers. Once America joined World War II, the discovery of the full extent of the Nazi extermination machine galvanized Jewish and non-Jewish Americans to confront the horror of anti-Semitic ideology. Open anti-Semitism faded, institutions struck down quota systems, and the suburbs opened up to Jews. Yet, while America became more willing to integrate Jews, the devastation of the Holocaust pushed many American Jews to double down on their specifically Jewish identities. Between 1945 and 1965, the Jewish community built over 1,000 synagogues, and the number of children attending Jewish schools more than doubled. While non-Jewish institutions became more accessible, the parallel organizations that Jews had set up grew even further, creating a vibrant, uniquely Jewish identity in the post-war years. Like so many immigrant groups in the past and the present, Jews fought for decades to be included in what it means to be American. They embraced the American ideals even when the country rejected them. They struggled to straddle two identities with a complex and at times antagonistic history, all of which has resulted in a proud, complicated, diverse community that has found a way to build a hybrid identity, both Jewish and American.
So one comment, maybe two comments, and then we're going to push to next week going into depth about the Jews coming to America. If you really want to start Jews coming to America, you go into the 1600s, I think it was Recife, where they first take off for the United States. They're not going that far back. They go back into the late 1800s, early 1900s. But I think, and I decided to play the whole thing because when I watched it the first time, it was before the war started, actually. And now, since the war, I decided to show it because, and I think if you may have thought of the same thing as you're watching, there are many parallels within, first of all, the idea of the immigrant experience. People make aliyah is not the same as the immigrant experience coming to the United States, but there are some parallels, whether it's language or acculturation or other things. That's first of all. And second of all, the whole idea of anti-Semitism and quotas and the world coming, not, really pushing, marginalizing the Jews. And it's just the same story over and over. And it's pretty sad state of affairs that Baruch Hashem right now we're in a very good position of what's going on. But just historically, you look at a video like that, you see not just how far we've come. It's also very important, and also like Rav Moshe Feinstein said, Tzaddik V'Kadosh Livracha referred to the United States in multiple responsa as a country of Chesed. They really did, in spite of what they didn't do for the Jews in many cases and problems, but still was a country of Chesed, especially where he came from Tsarist Russia. But there are things that still need to be fixed, obviously. And I will not get into any more details right now. It's all just my opinion. So in the meantime, we'll stop here, pick it up next week, Bezrat Hashem, and talk about Jews coming to America from the certain spot that I want to start from. And it'll probably take us 2-3 classes on the subject, I imagine. Once we've finished the Jews coming to America, we'll spend a good time also on Ellis Island. Not on the island, it's not Ellis Island, but you know what I mean. We're going to go back to pre-World War I and work our way into the early days of World War I and all that other stuff that goes with it. So in the meantime, wishing everyone a quiet night. Let's get some sleep, whether you're in the United States or here, and especially if you're here. We shouldn't be woken up by any alarms or sirens or anything else. And Bezrat Hashem, vanquishing our enemies. All right. Have a good day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.